Hey guys, my name is Weronika Mincewicz-Podrecka, and I'm here to present you my paper co-authored by me and Bartosz Janik. The paper is about social ontology of sexual consent and its legal implications, but not only legal, because it's about moral, social, and other applications of living, making choices when it comes to ontology of sexual consent. Firstly, to give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. First I will introduce the general concepts of consent, the theories of ontology of consent. Then I will place into more social contexts. I will tell you which theory we are inclined to pick in this context. Then I will give you a couple of case studies that apply these theories to the studies. And finally, I will move to conclusions and maybe other ways of fixing the issues with consent and the ontology itself. So let's get started. Okay, first thing, what is sexual consent, why it's important, what we are talking about? Well, the most important thing to remember talking about sexual consent, there is no simple solution, there is no one theory, there is no agreement on those issues. So something is contract, something is promise, something is justification for certain actions. What people agree on in general is that sexual consent always has subject and object. So it occurs in those types of situations when at least two people involved. It's generally based on sexual autonomy, and it's very important for any moral and legal decision when it comes to sexual relationships. It's just a general thing. We just see that sexual consent is important. Now we want to move on to the question that is crucial, at least for us, before moving to any further considerations, what we should do like legally and morally with sexual consent is what sexual consent actually is in terms of ontological theories. So basically we have two or three, I will explain in a second, theories about sexual consent. The first one is that sexual consent is a mental state. This theory is called the subjective of attitudinal view on sexual consent. It states that the mental state is enough to transform the rights and duties of others. This kind of mental state or this transformation have different shapes, and different scholars argue for other things in this area. For example, it can be waiving someone's rights or creating someone's rights when I'm consenting. But the important thing is the expression of consent can merely constitute evidence. What consent is this mental state that I have in my mind when I'm consenting to something. On the other hand, we have those theories which say no, like at least in sexual context, we don't have the mental state is not enough. What consent is a behavioral phenomenon. It's a way of expressing something, and it always requires expression. So in order for the consent in sexual relations to be valid, we need to express it somehow. Those types of expression may differ. Different scholars think about different types of behavior when it comes to expressing consent, but they incline that it should be expressed, not only indicated in your mind. The third group of theories, which I only describe in brief, is somewhere in between. They say that they call this, it's called hybrid views, which as the name says, is combining those two. So they say, okay, we need to have both the mental state and the performance of this mental state, the expression of this mental state, and then we can say that there was a consent in a given case. So having this short theoretical introduction, let's move to the context in which we are talking about those things, right? Because consent is not existing in vacuum. As I said before, consent is always existing when the people are coming together, at least two of them. And consent has this certain magical power, as Heidi Herd famously expressed, that transforms the moral obligations of others. So it renders in certain situation an action X of a person A towards a person B from action that was not morally permissible or legally permissible to a morally or legally permissible one. So it makes a huge impact on those relations, right? So it makes a difference what certain person can do to the other person, or how can they act in this relation. And the decision, if we want sexual consent to be understood like purely mental state or a behavior, directly affects the situation. So it affects those relationships, it affects those people involved in these situations, because it gives them different reasons, different circumstances on which they can act. Our thesis here, and I want to strongly emphasize it, is that the performative view of consent is a better choice when it comes to deciding on the ontological theory of sexual consent that we want to apply in those social circumstances, especially that we have right now in our social context, right? To prove it, I will demonstrate to you a couple of cases. Firstly, 2 cases just to indicate to you and show you how differently we can decide the cases depending which theory we want to apply to like actual situations. First example is taken both from Burnham. He calls it Kinky. So we have a situation where one guy goes to a bar, bring back his free drinking buddies and says to them, well, look, my wife likes kinky sex and she wants to have sex with you. And she will fake resistance because that's just the way she likes it. And it's true, right? Because she really likes it, she really like deep in mind consents to that and she wants it. So when we decide from like back point of view, we stand back and say whether there was a consent or not, well, it depends which theory we take here, right? Because when we talk about subjective theory of consent, then we say, yes, there was a consent because she consented. There was in her mind, her mental attitude says yes. And when we talk about performative theory of consent, we say, well, no, there was no indication that she consented. Whatever, presumptions, whatever parts of indication we apply here, because she never gave anyone expression of consent, right? It was her husband who said something, but her no. So in performative theories, we would say, well, no, there was no consent, it was morally wrong and probably legally wrong as well. On the other hand, let's inverse the situation. So we have an actual case of Pepper versus Burnham. It was a case from 1985. In this case, Rebecca's Burnham's husband beat Rebecca, forced her basically to go out on the road on the side of the house and entice motorists to have sex with her. Victor was photographing her meanwhile, but she was there. She was expressing this desire to the motorists to have sex with them. And when we talk about this situation, we also can take those 2 views, right? Because when we think about subjective view, we say no, she did not consent, right? Because in her mind, she was not consenting to this situation. When we talk about performative view, though, well, at least in relations to those motorists, we have to admit that she was consenting, right? Because she expressed those states. We obviously, when we apply hybrid view, can say here that the answer would also be no. So it's a difficult situation because on the other hand, we say, yes, she was hurt, but she was consenting, she expressed those feelings. And that's the thing that the performative theory also has to deal with. My answer, like quick answer on the spot, is more complicated question would be that, well, probably her husband is here the one to blame, not those motorists, and we can somehow morally or legally pursue him, not them, but when it comes to those relationships with her and the motorist, the consent was given. Now moving on to the cases which made us decide which theory is better for at least our social circumstances we have right now. 2 of them. First one, no reaction case. We have 2 people, A and B, they go to the same college, they share friends, they go to some common parties. It's commonly known that B has a partner. One day go to party, start kissing, talking. They had something to drink, but are conscious, so it doesn't affect their decision-making power. A thinks that they both want to move further. They think that's okay, then probably B just wants something more, wants to have sex with him, right? So he starts undressing B. B freezes, but does nothing to protest. A proceeds to have an intercourse with B. What can we say in this situation when we apply those theories? Well, firstly, if we take performative theory, giving the disclaimer that, for example, we apply the affirmative consent standard, then we would say, no, there was no consent, right? Because there was no indication of consent that A saw, so he should not have proceeded. When we come to the subjective theory of consent, we start to think, right? Because we don't know what A was thinking in this situation. Of course, we can incline, we can ask if there was a consent or not. But I think there's a couple of problems with that. Firstly, we have limited capability of knowing someone's mind and what they thought at this moment, right? So it's always going to be very evidential. The evidence will be always very circumstantial and not always believed. Secondly, there's exactly the problem of our current social norms and how they operate. So in these situations, I'm afraid that very often judges or people around will morally judge this person according to the certain social standards rules. So for example, if there was no indication of no, but only the silence and the freezing, they very often going to say that there was a consent, right? Why? Probably she was ashamed to say anything, or like ashamed of sexual situation. So we see that in subjective more view, we can come to different conclusions, right? And not necessarily to the ones that are positive for the potential victims. If second, even more, I would say, a hardcore situation is concerning this similar story. It's a token resistance one. So in this case, we have those same individuals. The difference with the situation is that A starts addressing B, and B says, no, let's not do this. So she's protesting and repeating it several times. At this time, but she does not walk away or use any physical resistance. A proceeds to have intercourse with B, and later on, B says she did not want this, she did not consent to this sex. A claims that, well, B really wanted it, she faked resistance because she's a boyfriend, ashamed, why she's saying all those things right now, right? When we come to the analysis from the point of our theories, when we take a performative one, well, we say definitely there was no consent, right? She clearly indicated no, she didn't want to participate in the situation. When it comes to the subjective one, we also say rather no, because we already have this evidence that she said no, she did, let's not do this. But then, what's the problem? Well, again, the same thing as before. So social circumstances, how those things and acts are seen. We often talk about token resistance. I'm very sure we are familiar with the term. So very often they say that women just fake resistance in this kind of sexual situation, but they really want it. It's just a token to, for example, prove that they don't want to, they are not sluts, they want to be seen in some positive way, or less want to be seen as prudent, right? So in this situation, when we talk about subjective analysis, I'm afraid very often when it comes to judges or even like social morality and people judging those people engaged in this situation, when we apply this subjective theory, we're gonna say, yeah, probably, probably maybe she wanted it, but she resisted, maybe he's right. And those entrenched stereotypical patterns of behavior that we see, at least from the part of people who are engaging in them, are very dangerous because they are entrenching those anti-female, very often behaviors which are not good from the social point of view and good from the societal point of view. And it can not apply on the society, because we believe that it can also apply to real judges, real court cases, when very often women are misjudged and they intentionally misjudged. So even though we believe that attitudinal theorists very often wanted to focus on this perspective, who wants something and why, if they consented, very often end up with different results, right? Because when someone is judging the situation, when someone's examining the situation, they don't have direct access to someone's mind, and they only can think what the person thought at this moment. And very often they're going to judge it from the perspective of the societal biases. And this will not happen when it comes to performative theory, because this way performative theory always applies certain kind of behavior-centered kinds of things that are expressing consent in this way. So I guess, as you see, to wrap it up a bit and then move on to the final remarks, we are strongly supporting the performative view on sexual consent, not simply because it's theoretically better, but also because it's socially better, right? As we said in the beginning, sexual interaction always occur in the social context. They are not occurring in vacuum. And we believe that in this context, performative theory gives us more coherent background for judging cases. They give us better background for moral decision for individuals, but also for legal practice for courts and so on and so on. So it's simply better in terms of achieving something in social context, especially right now, because we believe that society is very often unfair to women, minorities, and those people need the support for the background of these performative standards that can rely on when, for example, engaging in sexual consent, and they can also rely on that other people who are engaging in them know that they should require them from each other, right? So this way we're avoiding this she said, he said. Well, of course, we're not completely avoiding it, but trying to minimize the consequence of that, because we have certain performative expression of consent that has to be there, and that if it's not there, that probably the case is for the victim, right? So we believe right now we very much need this framework. Now, a bit shocking conclusion, because as I said, we are very much supporting this performative view of consent, but the question is, what are the results, right? So maybe there's a way of saving this attitudinal view of consent. Maybe it can work somehow. Well, as I said before, according to the mental view, consent is a mental state, but what the people who are supporting the mental state are doing with that, how they are placing it in the real social work, and does it work? Well, we have one guy, it's Antonio Guerrero, who talked about this a bit, and what he came up with was, he says the consent is a mental state, but what we are doing with the law or morality is basically applying normatively appropriate standards of what is required, epistemically speaking, to justify the belief that another person has consented or act on such a belief. So simply speaking, we don't talk about what consent is, but rather what we should look for in other person when we are in this sexual situation, when we think if they consented. And for me, it's when we come to the outcome, is quite the similar one to the one when we adopt performative view of the consent. Why? Well, first, I'm not going to go into details with that because it's a more complicated theory, but I'll just give you the brief overview, I would say. So what is required? Well, firstly, what Guerrero says, sexual consent is a high-stake moral context. It means that it's very important. It's not like renting someone a car, for example, and agreeing to that. And in order, just because of that, because of this high moral values that imply with sex and this relationship between individuals, one must possess a stronger evidence, so some further investigation or whatever, to justifiably believe that the other person has consent, right? I think this is quite pretty straightforward, but when it comes to our conclusion and our connection with this case, my other question is, what is this strong evidence, right? And I think that most likely this strong evidence will be some case of expressed behavior, right? So we're coming back to the same thing that we talked about before. We have behavior which has to be expressed in the performative view. Here we have also expressed behavior, probably, which we need to, for consent to be considered valid. So I think those theories are kind of similar in the outcome, and let me end up here in hopeful note. I strongly believe that performative view of sexual consent is a better one, but it better applies to social circumstances. But even if we applied attitudinal view, we can also come to circumstances in which we can require from individuals this degree of care that is inclined in performative consent standards. So probably we finally will be able, at some point at least, to create better consent standards. Thank you.